to help you get ready for the review of information from Chapter 3 assessment that's going to be posted with this video. And also I need to point out that I just realized next week is finals week, so we will not be moving on to Chapter 4. Starting next week, I will be providing an overall review and an assessment. Not a final exam, but it will give you an idea of how much you got this year. All right, let's start with Chapter 3. So the first thing we talked about in Chapter 3, or one of the first things we talked about, were limiting factors. And limiting factors are those things that there's just enough of for a particular population, a particular group of organisms to survive on. For example, one of the reasons that people have a fever in response to an infection is that when your body temperature goes up, your body starts storing iron, and iron turns out to be a limiting factor for bacteria that are growing in your body. So by storing that iron, you're limiting the amount of bacteria that can grow. It's one of the ways we help defend ourselves from infections. There are other limiting factors out there for every single biome, for every single ecosystem. There are going to be things that are only a certain amount is available. And that will divide the ecosystem into regions. One of those regions will be the region of intolerance. And for that particular organism, a region of intolerance they cannot survive in. There may be other organisms where the limiting factor is available to them in high enough quantities, but for a particular organism, that region would be an area of intolerance. If we go to a certain altitude without using artificial ways to provide oxygen, that's a region of intolerance for humans. There are also stress regions. And in a stress region, organisms can survive, but not well. So you would expect to find fewer organisms in a region of stress. The best place for an organism to be is in an optimal zone. That's where you'll find the most organisms of a particular type. So you could expect to see a graph that would be something like this. And here, if we graph, let's see, number of organisms and zones. So from here to here we have intolerance. From here to here we have stress. From here to here, that's the optimal zone. And I kind of went low here, but so over here we'd have the same thing. The next one would be intolerance, stress and intolerance on this side. And this is for a particular species. This might be trout in a stream. This might be any organism in any ecosystem. Because of limiting factors, there will be parts of that ecosystem where that organism is intolerant, parts where it can survive but it's going to be under stress, and parts where it will do just well, just fine. All right, the next thing I want to touch on is when we have disturbances to an ecosystem. Most places are at a stable ecosystem. And most ecosystems are going to be very much changing throughout time, but they're relatively stable. But sometimes that gets disturbed. It could be a fire, could be a natural disaster, and in some cases it could be even the formation of brand new landforms when we get volcanic islands appearing in oceans and such, or even volcanic eruptions on the planet. So when there's total loss, we have no soil, we have barren rock, and when that happens, the first organisms that do make it in are called pioneer species. And those pioneer species are going to make their way when there is no soil. So when you have a total loss of soil, and one of their roles is to begin to rebuild soil. Now we can have fires, floods, windstorms, erosion, things where we lose species. We have a disturbance, but we don't lose the soil, and then different organisms will come in. They are still might be referred to as pioneer species, but they are not the same kind of pioneer species that come in when there is no soil. They're not really true pioneer species. They'll be the first organisms to repopulate a given area. And that process is called succession. So primary succession involves pioneer species, and primary succession is very rare. Things like volcanic eruptions are going to lead to the introduction of pioneer species. And the succession that way. Secondary succession refers to a major disturbance in an area, and it's still a relatively depending on the climate, list of what's going to come in, but it's not quite going down to pioneer species. The other thing that's important, that's similar to succession, is remember mountains. They have changes in altitude. So as you go higher, the climate for that particular region changes, and that change is similar to what we have on Earth, which are latitudes. So the closer you get to the poles, or the closer you get to the equator, you are at different latitudes, and those latitudes, like altitudes, have associated climates. So you can go up a mountain, and it's going to seem like you are going up in latitude. So we can get, on a single mountain, we can get a number of different biomes. And that's really what we've gone through to so far in this chapter. Biomes are what I like to call climax communities. There are a number of them. And if we start at the North Pole, we would get tundra, temperate forest. Sorry, I skipped one. We would get boreal forest, which is also called taiga. From the boreal forest, then we go to temperate forest. Temperate forest, we go to woodlands, shrublands. From there, grasslands, temperate grasslands. And those grasslands, a good example in North America are the prairies. So a lot of the prairies, most of the prairies have been converted to farmland now, but originally, before they were settled, those prairies, those grasslands, provided a grazing opportunity for large herds of bison, which are herbivores, bison or buffalo herbivores. We also have for biomes a desert. Remember, there are deserts on all continents except Europe. We have savanna was another one. Seasonal rainforest and tropical rainforests. And tropical rainforests are warm, wet biomes, and warm, wet biomes tend to support a lot of different species. So things like tropical rainforests are where we find a large, probably the greatest diversity of biological creatures anywhere in any of the biomes, because the limiting factors are there's more of them. There's more water, there's more heat, and more nutrients in warm, wet biomes like tropical rainforests. Those were land biomes. We also had some aquatic biomes or water-based biomes. Remember, 2/3 of the earth is covered with water, but a very small percentage of that is fresh water. And that fresh water is divided between surface water, groundwater, and frozen water. Most of the aquatic freshwater organisms we find in surface water, and the surface water would be streams, lakes, ponds. When we talk about lakes and ponds, we divide the regions into the limnetic zone, the littoral zone, and the profundal zone. The limnetic zone has lots of light, lots of plankton, and this is where you find most of your species, because with lots of light and lots of plankton forming the base of the food chain, this is where you're going to find most of the life. In addition to the freshwater ecosystems, there are also marine ecosystems, which would be salt water environments. And then we talked about a couple of transitional environments, estuaries, tidal zones. So really, we've talked about the kinds of places on the planet we find life. Life we've been talking about all year long, starting with the chemicals that make up a cell, the cells that make up the two groups of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic, the two types of eukaryotic, plant and animal. So we're really talking about when those cells in multicellular organisms get together, where they live on the planet. All right, so as I said, next week is finals week. We will be wrapping up and kind of give you a big overview of the whole year. I want to thank you again. Keep up the good work. I'll be posting again tomorrow.